In a quiet suburban neighborhood where life moved at a predictable pace, Christopher Reynolds lived an unassuming life. He was the kind of person who blended into the background, friendly enough to exchange pleasantries with neighbors, but not someone people noticed much beyond that. At 34 years old, Christopher worked as a librarian at the local public library, spending his days surrounded by books and helping patrons find what they needed. His older sister, Margaret Reynolds, often teased him about how boring his job sounded, though she secretly admired his dedication to something so meaningful. What no one could have predicted was that this ordinary man's life would soon become the center of a shocking and deeply personal scandal involving none other than his own sister, the powerful FBI director. Margaret Reynolds had always been different from her younger brother. Where Christopher preferred calm routines and solitude, Margaret thrived on challenges and leadership. She rose through the ranks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with remarkable speed, earning respect for her sharp mind, unwavering determination, and ability to handle even the toughest cases. By the time she became the first female FBI director in history, Margaret was already a household name. Her success brought pride to their family, especially to Christopher, who never missed an opportunity to brag about his big sis to friends and co-workers. Despite their differences, the siblings shared a bond rooted in mutual admiration and trust. They were each other's confidants, always ready to lend support when life got tough, but nothing could prepare them for the storm that was about to hit. One crisp autumn evening, Christopher returned home after a long day at work. The streets were dimly lit, and the air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. As he unlocked his front door, he noticed flashing red and blue lights down the block. A neighbor's house had been burglarized earlier that day, and police officers were busy questioning residents and searching for clues. Curious, Christopher lingered outside for a moment, watching as officers combed the area. Little did he know, this seemingly routine investigation would change everything. A young officer approached Christopher, asking if he'd seen anything unusual that evening. Christopher shook his head, explaining that he'd been at work all day and hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. But as the conversation continued, the officer's gaze shifted to Christopher's arm. There was a small scratch there, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. The neighbor who reported the crime claimed to have seen someone matching Christopher's description running away from the scene. When asked about the scratch, Christopher explained it happened while pruning bushes in his backyard earlier that week. To him, it seemed like a harmless coincidence, but to the officer it appeared suspicious. Before Christopher knew what was happening, he found himself sitting in the back of a squad car, handcuffed and bewildered. The police told him they were taking him in for questioning, citing the circumstantial evidence against him. Broken glass near his property line and stolen items discovered in a nearby trash can sealed the deal. Though Christopher insisted he was innocent, the authorities weren't convinced. Within hours, news of his arrest spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. Friends and acquaintances whispered behind closed doors, torn between disbelief and doubt. How could someone as mild-mannered as Christopher be capable of such a crime? For Margaret, however, there was no room for uncertainty. Her brother wasn't guilty, and she was determined to prove it. When Margaret received the call about Christopher's arrest, she felt as though the ground beneath her feet had crumbled. It was late at night, and she had just finished reviewing files for an upcoming congressional hearing. The phone rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. On the other end, Christopher's voice trembled as he recounted the events leading up to his detention. Margaret listened intently, her heart pounding, with a mix of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, and helplessness. Here she was, one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, yet powerless to stop her own brother from being wrongfully accused. The next morning, Margaret called an emergency meeting with her closest advisors within the FBI. She wanted answers, and she wanted them fast. While maintaining professionalism, she made it clear that this case was personal. Some members of her team expressed concern about potential conflicts of interest, warning her that getting too involved might damage her reputation. Others quietly supported her efforts, knowing full well the weight of having a loved one unjustly targeted. Margaret brushed aside their reservations, reminding everyone that justice should apply equally to all citizens, regardless of status or connections. If the system failed her brother, it could fail anyone. As the days passed, Margaret threw herself into uncovering the truth. She spent sleepless nights poring over police reports, scrutinizing every detail for inconsistencies. One glaring issue stood out: the lack of concrete evidence tying Christopher to the burglary. The scratch on his arm, which initially seemed damning, turned out to be weeks old according to medical records. Furthermore, the stolen items found in the trash bin were wrapped in packaging materials that didn't match anything Christopher owned. These discrepancies fueled Margaret's resolve, but they also deepened her frustration. Why hadn't the police conducted a more thorough investigation before arresting him? Publicly, Margaret maintained her composure, attending meetings and giving interviews as usual. Privately, however, she wrestled with doubts and fears. Every time she saw Christopher behind bars during visitation hours, her chest tightened with guilt and sorrow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed him, not just as a sister, but as someone entrusted with upholding justice. Yet amidst the turmoil, Margaret clung to one unshakable belief: the truth would eventually come to light. And when it did, she vowed to hold those responsible accountable, not out of vengeance, but because fairness mattered more than anything else. Word of Christopher's arrest quickly made headlines, sparking intense media scrutiny and public debate. Reporters descended upon Margaret's home and office, eager to capture soundbites and snapshots of the embattled FBI director. Tabloids ran sensational stories, painting Christopher as either a misunderstood victim or a cunning criminal hiding behind his famous sibling. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags, turning the entire ordeal into a spectacle. For Margaret, navigating this chaotic landscape proved almost as challenging as proving her brother's innocence. Critics wasted no time seizing on the situation to question Margaret's integrity. Political opponents accused her of abusing her power to manipulate the case outcome, while conspiracy theorists speculated about hidden motives behind her actions. Even some allies within the FBI began distancing themselves, fearing association with controversy. Through it all, Margaret remained stoic, refusing to dignify baseless accusations with responses. Instead, she focused on assembling a legal dream team to represent Christopher. Hiring renowned defense attorney Jonathan Hayes, known for securing acquittals in high-profile trials, signaled her determination to fight tooth and nail. Meanwhile, Margaret leaned heavily on her inner circle for emotional support. Close friends reminded her of her strengths, urging her not to let external noise derail her mission. Her husband, David, stood firmly by her side, managing logistics and shielding her from unnecessary distractions. Together, they created a strategy to manage public perception without compromising the investigation. Margaret gave carefully crafted statements emphasizing her faith in due process and commitment to transparency. Behind the scenes, however, she seethed with indignation, channeling her anger into productive avenues. Each setback only strengthened her resolve to expose the flaws plaguing the justice system and ensure that no one else endured what her family was going through. Despite the mounting pressure, Margaret refused to give up. She poured all her energy into finding definitive proof of Christopher's innocence, driven by a fierce sense of duty and love. This harrowing journey tested her limits, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and accountability. But through it all, Margaret emerged stronger, more resolute, and infinitely wiser, a testament to the enduring strength of familial bonds and the pursuit of justice. The days following Christopher's arrest felt like an eternity for Margaret Reynolds. The weight of her responsibilities as FBI director pressed down on her shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the emotional toll of seeing her brother locked up for a crime he didn't commit. Every morning she woke up with a knot in her stomach, dreading another day of fighting against a system that seemed determined to keep him behind bars. Yet Margaret refused to let despair take over. She channeled her anger and frustration into action, knowing that time was running out. Margaret began by reaching out to trusted colleagues within the FBI, people who had worked alongside her for years and understood her unwavering commitment to justice. She assembled a small team of agents, handpicked for their discretion and expertise, and tasked them with re-examining every aspect of the burglary case. Officially, this operation was framed as part of a broader review of investigative practices across the country. Unofficially, it was a personal mission to save her brother. Margaret knew the risks involved. Involving federal resources in a local matter could be seen as overreach. But at that moment, she didn't care. All that mattered was uncovering the truth. Her team started by analyzing the evidence presented by the police. What they found was alarming. The forensic report indicated that the burglar wore gloves during the break-in, which meant the scratch on Christopher's arm couldn't possibly have come from forcing open the window. Furthermore, witness statements were inconsistent. One neighbor claimed to have seen someone matching Christopher's build fleeing the scene, while another described the suspect as taller and wearing a hoodie. None of these details aligned with Christopher's appearance or clothing on the night in question. It became clear that the police had rushed to judgment, relying on flimsy circumstantial evidence rather than conducting a thorough investigation. While her team dug deeper, Margaret turned her attention to securing top-notch legal representation for Christopher. She hired Jonathan Hayes, one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in the nation. Known for his meticulous preparation and courtroom charisma, Hayes had a reputation for turning hopeless cases around. When Margaret met him for the first time, she laid out the situation plainly. "My brother is innocent and I need you to prove it." Hayes nodded gravely, promising to leave no stone unturned in building a robust defense strategy. Hayes immediately filed motions to suppress key pieces of evidence, arguing that they lacked credibility and violated proper investigative protocols. He also requested access to surveillance footage from nearby businesses, hoping to find visual proof that could exonerate Christopher. Meanwhile, Margaret's team scoured the neighborhood, interviewing witnesses who hadn't been contacted by the police. One elderly woman recalled seeing a man loitering near the victim's house earlier that afternoon, a man who didn't resemble Christopher at all. This new information added fuel to the growing fire of doubt surrounding the prosecution's Cersei. As the legal battle unfolded, Margaret faced mounting challenges both personally and professionally. Public opinion remained divided, with some rallying behind her efforts to free her brother and others accusing her of using her influence to manipulate the outcome. Critics argued that her involvement undermined the integrity of the judicial process, while supporters praised her courage in standing up for what was right. The constant scrutiny took its toll, leaving Margaret feeling isolated and drained. Colleagues noticed dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her voice during meetings. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she continued to push forward, driven by an unyielding belief in justice. Behind closed doors, Margaret wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was furious at the incompetence and bias that had led to Christopher's wrongful arrest. On the other hand, she felt a deep sense of guilt for not being able to prevent it. She replayed conversations in her head, wondering if there was something she could have done differently, some sign she missed or some warning she failed to heed. These thoughts haunted her late at night, when the world outside went quiet and all she had was the sound of her own breathing. To cope with the stress, Margaret leaned heavily on her family. Her husband, David, became her rock, offering steady support and reminding her to take breaks even when she felt like working nonstop. Their teenage daughter, Emily, though too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, sensed her mother's distress and tried to cheer her up with hugs and homemade cookies. Christopher himself remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, refusing to let bitterness consume him. During visitation hours, he reassured Margaret that he believed in her and trusted her to make things right. His calm demeanor gave her strength, even on the darkest days. Despite the chaos swirling around her, Margaret made progress. Her team uncovered critical leads that cast serious doubt on the prosecution's narrative. For instance, phone records showed that Christopher had been talking to a coworker at the library around the time the burglary occurred, providing him with a solid alibi. Additionally, receipts from a grocery store near his house placed him miles away from the crime scene shortly before the break-in. These discoveries bolstered Hayes' arguments in court, forcing prosecutors to reconsider their stance. But perhaps the most significant breakthrough came when Margaret's team obtained surveillance footage from a gas station located 2 blocks away from the victim's house. The grainy video showed a man entering the premises just minutes before the burglary. Though the image quality was poor, advanced facial recognition software identified the individual as Marcus Kane, a career criminal with a long rap sheet for similar offenses. Further investigation revealed that Kane had recently stayed with a friend in the same neighborhood and had fled town shortly after the incident. This revelation struck a devastating blow to the prosecution's case, raising serious questions about why the police hadn't pursued this lead earlier. Armed with this new evidence, Margaret approached the local police department, demanding they reopen the investigation. However, she encountered stiff resistance. Some officers resented what they perceived as interference from the federal government, viewing it as a threat to their authority. Others feared admitting mistakes would tarnish their reputations or lead to disciplinary action. Frustrated but undeterred, Margaret escalated the matter, threatening to involve the Department of Justice if necessary. Her relentless pressure finally paid off when prosecutors agreed to drop all charges against Christopher, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. When the news broke that Christopher would be released, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of relief. She hugged her brother tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Christopher simply smiled, saying, "You did everything you could. That's all that matters." Though the victory was sweet, it left a bitter aftertaste. Margaret couldn't help but think about the countless others who didn't have someone like her in their corner. People languishing in jail because of systemic failures and biases. This realization ignited a fire within her, sparking a desire to enact lasting change. In the weeks that followed, Margaret threw herself into advocating for reforms aimed at preventing wrongful arrests. She proposed mandatory training programs for law enforcement officers, focusing on evidence collection, witness interrogation techniques, and recognizing implicit biases. She pushed for increased use of technology, such as body cameras and AI-driven analytics, to reduce human error and ensure accountability. Margaret also called for independent oversight boards to review controversial cases, ensuring transparency and fairness in the justice system. Her efforts sparked heated debates both inside and outside the FBI. Supporters hailed her as a visionary leader willing to tackle tough issues head-on. Detractors accused her of overstepping her bounds and politicizing law enforcement. Despite the backlash, Margaret stood firm, driven by the knowledge that real change required bold action. She often thought about Christopher's ordeal, using it as motivation to keep pushing forward. If her work could spare even one family from experiencing the pain hers had endured, it would be worth every ounce of effort. For Christopher, life slowly began returning to normal. Freed from the shadow of suspicion, he resumed his duties at the library, grateful for the outpouring of support from friends and colleagues. Yet the experience left an indelible mark on him. He realized how fragile trust in institutions could be and how easily lives could be destroyed by unchecked power. Inspired by his sister's determination, Christopher decided to channel his newfound perspective into activism. He joined forces with organizations advocating for prisoners' rights, determined to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. Together, he and Margaret became symbols of resilience and hope, proving that adversity could inspire meaningful change. Though the scars of the ordeal lingered, Margaret found solace in knowing she'd used her position to make a difference. She understood now that leadership wasn't just about wielding authority. It was about serving others, especially those without a voice. And in doing so, she honored not only her brother, but also the principles she had sworn to uphold. Margaret Reynolds had always been a woman of action, but the fight to clear her brother's name pushed her into uncharted territory. The evidence against Christopher was crumbling under closer scrutiny, yet the justice system seemed reluctant to admit its mistakes. Margaret knew that proving his innocence wasn't enough. She needed to expose the flaws in the process that allowed such errors to happen in the first place. With her team working tirelessly behind the scenes and Jonathan Hayes mounting a formidable defense, Margaret decided it was time to take matters into her own hands, publicly. She called an emergency press conference, a rare move for someone as private as Margaret. Reporters packed the room, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as she stepped up to the podium. Dressed in her usual professional attire, Margaret looked composed, though those who knew her well could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. She began by thanking everyone for their patience and understanding before diving headfirst into the heart of the issue. "What happened to my brother is not just a personal tragedy," she said firmly. "It is a reflection of deeper problems within our justice system, problems we can no longer ignore." Margaret outlined the inconsistencies in the case against Christopher, the lack of credible forensic evidence, the unreliable witness testimonies, and the failure to pursue alternative leads like Marcus Kane. She presented documents and visuals to support her claims, ensuring her argument was grounded in facts rather than emotion. Her voice remained steady, even as she described how painful it was to watch her brother sit in jail while bureaucrats debated procedural technicalities. "Christopher isn't just my brother," she continued. "He's a human being whose life has been turned upside down because of negligence and bias. And if this can happen to him, with all the resources at my disposal, what does that say about the countless others without powerful advocates?" The press conference sent shockwaves through the nation. Some praised Margaret's transparency and courage, applauding her willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Others accused her of grandstanding, suggesting she was exploiting her position to sway public opinion. Social media erupted with hashtags like "Justice for Christopher" and "FBI overreach," dividing opinions further. For Margaret, none of this mattered. What mattered was shining a light on systemic failures and demanding accountability, not just for her brother, but for everyone affected by similar injustices. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes used the growing attention to his advantage. He filed additional motions in court citing newly uncovered evidence, including surveillance footage of Marcus Kane, and arguing that prosecuting Christopher amounted to prosecutorial misconduct. Hayes's arguments gained traction when independent experts reviewed the case and agreed that the original investigation had been deeply flawed. Prosecutors, now facing mounting pressure from both the legal community and the public, began to waver. They quietly signaled their willingness to negotiate, hinting that dropping the charges might be the best course of action. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with simply getting Christopher out of jail. She wanted answers and accountability. She launched an internal review within the FBI, framing it as part of a broader initiative to improve collaboration between federal and local law enforcement agencies. In reality, however, this review was aimed squarely at identifying why the burglary investigation had gone so wrong. Margaret handpicked agents known for their integrity and analytical skills, assigning them to dig deep into the case files, interview key players, and assess whether racial or socioeconomic biases had influenced the outcome. Her team uncovered troubling patterns. Police reports revealed that officers had dismissed potential suspects early on simply because they didn't fit preconceived notions of what a burglar should look like. Several witnesses reported seeing Marcus Kane loitering near the victim's house, but their statements were either ignored or misfiled. Even more concerning was the discovery that budget cuts had forced the department to reduce training programs for detectives, leaving many ill-equipped to handle complex investigations. These findings painted a damning picture of institutional neglect and complacency. Margaret shared these revelations during another high-profile briefing, this time targeting policymakers and lawmakers. She called for sweeping reforms, including mandatory implicit bias training for all law enforcement personnel, increased funding for investigative tools like DNA testing and surveillance technology, and stricter oversight mechanisms to prevent rushed arrests based on weak evidence. Her proposals sparked intense debate in Congress, with some legislators praising her proactive approach and others dismissing it as overreach. Margaret stood firm, using every ounce of her influence to push the agenda forward. Behind the scenes, Margaret continued to grapple with the emotional toll of the ordeal. While her public persona remained strong and resolute, privately she struggled with guilt and frustration. She replayed moments in her mind, wondering if she could have intervened sooner or handled things differently. During late-night conversations with David, she admitted feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead. "I thought I understood the system," she confessed one evening, staring blankly at the wall. "But now I realize how broken it really is, and fixing it feels impossible." David listened patiently, offering words of encouragement whenever he could. "You're doing everything you can," he reminded her. "That's all anyone can. Ask." Their daughter, Emily, also played a crucial role in keeping Margaret grounded. On particularly tough days, Emily would leave little notes around the house. "You're amazing, Mom," or "We believe in you." That brought tears to Margaret's eyes. These small acts of kindness reminded her why she kept fighting, for her family, for justice, and for the belief that change was possible. As weeks turned into months, the tide began to shift. Prosecutors officially dropped all charges against Christopher, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence pointing to Marcus Kane as the real culprit. Kane himself was arrested after authorities tracked him down in a neighboring state, where he had attempted another burglary. When news of his capture broke, the public reaction was swift and decisive. Many expressed outrage that the police had failed to identify him earlier, while others praised Margaret for persisting despite immense challenges. For Christopher, the vindication was bittersweet. Though grateful to be free, he couldn't shake the memory of sitting in a cell, branded as a criminal. With Christopher's name cleared, Margaret turned her focus fully toward reform efforts. She traveled across the country, meeting with police chiefs, district attorneys, and community leaders to discuss ways to prevent wrongful arrests. She spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds, and appeared on talk shows, using her platform to amplify marginalized voices often overlooked in discussions about justice. Her message was simple yet powerful. Every person deserves fairness, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Her advocacy inspired others to join the cause. Activists rallied around her initiatives, organizing protests and petitions to demand change. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at implementing her proposed reforms, citing her work as a blueprint for progress. Even critics softened their stance, recognizing the sincerity and urgency of her mission. Margaret became a symbol of hope for families torn apart by wrongful convictions, proof that determination and leadership could drive meaningful transformation. Yet amidst the accolades and achievements, Margaret never lost sight of what truly mattered. She spent hours talking with Christopher, reflecting on everything they had been through together. They discussed the fragility of trust in institutions designed to protect citizens and vowed to continue fighting for those unable to fight for themselves. Margaret realized that while power gave her a voice, love, for her brother, for justice, and for humanity itself, was the true force propelling her forward. By the end of the year, Margaret's efforts yielded tangible results. New laws were passed requiring stricter standards for evidence collection and review processes. Independent oversight boards were established to investigate controversial cases, ensuring transparency and accountability. Training programs focused on reducing implicit bias became mandatory for law enforcement officers nationwide. These changes weren't perfect, but they represented significant steps toward a fairer and more equitable justice system. For Margaret, the journey reinforced a fundamental truth. Leadership wasn't about titles or authority, it was about service. By standing up for her brother, she had inadvertently sparked a movement that transcended personal grievances and addressed systemic inequities. Though scars from the ordeal remained, they served as reminders of the resilience required to create lasting change. And as Margaret looked toward the future, she did so with renewed purpose, knowing that her work was far from over. But neither was her determination. With Christopher's name finally cleared and the real culprit, Marcus Kane, behind bars, Margaret Reynolds could have taken a step back. After all, her brother was free, his innocence proven beyond doubt. But for Margaret, this victory felt incomplete. She couldn't shake the feeling that if it weren't for her position as FBI director, Christopher might still be languishing in jail, or worse, facing trial for a crime he didn't commit. The thought haunted her. How many others, like him, were trapped in similar situations without influential family members to fight for them? This realization ignited a fire within her, a determination not just to fix what had gone wrong in Christopher's case, but to overhaul the entire system that allowed such injustices to happen. Margaret threw herself into advocacy work with an intensity that surprised even her closest allies. She began by addressing one of the most glaring issues she had uncovered during her investigation: inadequate training for law enforcement officers. Many departments across the country were underfunded, forcing them to cut corners when it came to hiring qualified personnel or providing ongoing education. As a result, detectives often relied on outdated methods or gut instincts rather than evidence-based practices. Margaret knew this had to change. She spearheaded a nationwide initiative called Justice Forward, aimed at improving investigative standards and accountability. Under this program, federal funds would be allocated to local police departments to upgrade their training programs, particularly in areas like forensic science, witness interrogation techniques, and recognizing implicit biases. Margaret also advocated for the widespread use of technology, such as body cameras and AI-driven analytics, to reduce human error and increase transparency. "We owe it to the public and to ourselves to get this right," she declared during a televised address. "Every arrest, every charge, every conviction must be built on solid ground. Anything less is unacceptable." The announcement of Justice Forward sparked heated debates. Supporters hailed Margaret as a visionary leader willing to tackle systemic problems head-on. Critics, however, accused her of overstepping her authority, arguing that policing should remain a local matter. Some even suggested her reforms were politically motivated, designed to bolster her image after the controversy surrounding Christopher's arrest. Margaret brushed off these accusations, focusing instead on building coalitions with stakeholders who shared her vision. She met with police chiefs, district attorneys, civil rights activists, and community leaders, listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into the plan. Slowly but surely, support for Justice Forward grew. One of the key components of the initiative was the establishment of independent oversight boards tasked with reviewing controversial cases. These boards would consist of diverse members, including legal experts, academics, and representatives from marginalized communities. Their role would be to ensure investigations were conducted fairly and transparently, holding law enforcement accountable for any lapses. Margaret believed this measure was critical as it addressed the lack of trust between citizens and the justice system. "Accountability isn't punishment," she explained during a panel discussion. "It's about creating a culture where everyone feels confident that the system works for them, not against them." While pushing for institutional reforms, Margaret also worked tirelessly to amplify the voices of those directly impacted by wrongful arrests. She partnered with organizations advocating for prisoners' rights, hosting town halls and roundtable discussions to give survivors of injustice a platform to share their stories. One such event featured a young woman named Lisa Martinez, who had spent 3 years in prison before being exonerated thanks to DNA evidence. Lisa's testimony moved many in the audience to tears as she described the emotional toll of losing her freedom, her career, and nearly her sanity. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "But until we fix the system, people will keep suffering." Hearing stories like Lisa's reinforced Margaret's resolve. She realized that reform wasn't just about policy changes. It was about restoring faith in humanity. It was about showing people that they mattered, that their pain was acknowledged, and that someone cared enough to make things better. For Margaret, this understanding deepened her connection to the cause. She no longer saw herself merely as a government official implementing programs. She saw herself as a champion for those who had been silenced. Christopher, too, found a renewed sense of purpose in the aftermath of his ordeal. Inspired by Margaret's efforts, he joined forces with advocacy groups, using his experience to shed light on the flaws in the justice system. He gave interviews, wrote articles, and spoke at events urging others to demand accountability and fairness. At first, speaking publicly about his arrest made him uneasy. He worried about being judged or reliving painful memories. but the outpouring of support he received gave him courage. "If sharing my story helps even one person avoid what I went through, then it's worth it," he told an interviewer. His words resonated deeply, earning him admiration from advocates and ordinary citizens alike. Despite the progress being made, Margaret faced significant challenges along the way. Resistance from entrenched interests threatened to derail her initiatives at every turn. Some police unions opposed mandatory body cameras, claiming they infringed on officers' privacy. Others argued that increased oversight would demoralize law enforcement and hinder their ability to do their jobs effectively. Margaret countered these arguments with data and personal anecdotes, emphasizing that accountability benefited everyone, not just civilians but also ethical officers who wanted to serve with integrity. Her persistence paid off when Congress passed landmark legislation requiring all law enforcement agencies to adopt standardized protocols for evidence collection and review processes. The bill also mandated funding for training programs and independent oversight boards, ensuring that Margaret's vision became reality. When President signed the bill into law, Margaret stood beside him on stage, her heart swelling with pride. "This is a victory for justice," she said during her speech. "But let us never forget that true justice requires constant vigilance. We must continue to listen, learn, and adapt if we are to build a future where fairness is the norm, not the exception." Though the legislative win marked a major milestone, Margaret knew there was still much work to be done. Changing laws was one thing, changing mindsets was another. She recognized that lasting reform required cultural shifts, breaking down stereotypes, fostering empathy, and encouraging collaboration between communities and law enforcement. To achieve this, she launched educational campaigns targeting schools, universities, and civic organizations. Through workshops, documentaries, and social media outreach, she sought to engage younger generations in conversations about justice and equality. "Our children are the architects of tomorrow," she often said. "If we teach them the value of fairness today, they'll carry that lesson forward long after we're gone." As the months passed, Margaret's tireless advocacy earned her global recognition. She received awards from human rights organizations, honorary degrees from prestigious universities, and invitations to speak at international forums. Yet despite the accolades, she remained humble, always crediting her team and collaborators for their contributions. "This isn't about me," she insisted whenever someone praised her achievements. "It's about the collective effort of countless individuals working toward a common goal. None of this would be possible without them." Behind the scenes, Margaret continued to lean on her family for strength. David and Emily remained her pillars of support, offering comfort and encouragement during moments of doubt. They celebrated each triumph together, whether it was the passage of a new law or the release of yet another wrongfully convicted individual. Christopher, meanwhile, became more than just a sibling. He was now a partner in her mission, someone who understood firsthand the importance of fighting for justice. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, forged in the crucible of adversity and tempered by shared purpose. Looking back on everything they had endured, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. Though the journey had been fraught with obstacles, it had also brought clarity and meaning to her life. She realized that true leadership wasn't about wielding power, it was about empowering others. By standing up for her brother, she had inadvertently ignited a movement that transcended personal grievances and addressed systemic inequities. And while scars from the ordeal remained, they served as reminders of the resilience required to create lasting change. For Margaret, the road ahead was clear. There would always be setbacks, naysayers, and moments of uncertainty. But armed with love, for her family, for justice, and for humanity itself, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, it wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about proving that fairness, compassion, and hope could prevail, even in the darkest of times. Years had passed since the harrowing ordeal that began with Christopher Reynolds' wrongful arrest and culminated in sweeping reforms within the justice system. Margaret Reynolds, once embroiled in controversy, emerged as one of the most transformative figures in modern law enforcement history. Her relentless pursuit of justice for her brother not only exonerated him but also ignited a movement that reshaped how investigations were conducted across the nation. Though scars from the experience lingered, they served as reminders of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of love. Christopher's life slowly returned to normal after his release. Freed from the shadow of suspicion, he resumed his role at the library, where colleagues greeted him warmly, eager to welcome him back into their fold. Yet the ordeal had changed him profoundly. The months spent behind bars left an indelible mark on his psyche. Sleepless nights plagued by memories of cold cell walls and whispered conversations among inmates. But rather than letting bitterness consume him, Christopher channeled his pain into purpose. He co-authored a memoir titled Innocence Lost, A Brother's Fight for Justice, which chronicled his wrongful arrest, imprisonment, and eventual vindication. The book became a bestseller, resonating deeply with readers who saw reflections of their own struggles in its pages. Through his writing and public speaking engagements, Christopher became an advocate for prisoners' rights, determined to amplify voices often ignored by society. He traveled across the country, meeting individuals whose lives had been shattered by wrongful convictions or systemic failures. Each story fueled his resolve to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone, still trapped in the labyrinth of injustice. "I'm lucky," he often said during interviews. "I had my sister, someone powerful enough to fight for me. But what about those who don't? That's why I won't stop until the system works for everyone." Margaret, too, found new meaning in her role as FBI director. While she remained steadfast in her commitment to national security, her legacy was defined by her advocacy for justice reform. The initiatives she spearheaded, Justice Forward, independent oversight boards, mandatory training programs, continued to shape modern policing practices long after she stepped down from her position. Law enforcement agencies reported fewer instances of wrongful arrests, thanks to improved investigative standards and increased accountability measures. Technology like body cameras and AI-driven analytics became commonplace, reducing human error and bias in investigations. Communities that had once distrusted the police began rebuilding relationships, fostering collaboration instead of conflict. Her efforts earned her global admiration, yet Margaret remained grounded, always crediting others for their contributions. When asked about her motivations during a televised interview shortly before retiring, she smiled softly and said, "It wasn't about me. It was about proving that fairness matters more than anything else." She went on to explain how her journey taught her the importance of humility, empathy, and perseverance. "Power doesn't make you invincible," she reflected. "It makes you responsible for protecting the vulnerable, for standing up when no one else will, and for believing in the possibility of change, even when it seems impossible." Retirement gave Margaret time to reflect on everything she had accomplished and everything she had sacrificed. There were moments when she wondered if she could have done more, pushed harder, or acted faster. But looking back, she realized that perfection wasn't the goal, progress was. Every policy change, every exoneration, every life touched by her work represented a step toward a fairer, more equitable world. And though the road ahead would always require vigilance, she took solace in knowing that the foundation had been laid. David and Emily played pivotal roles in helping Margaret transition to this quieter phase of her life. They encouraged her to take up hobbies she had neglected during her decades-long career, gardening, painting, and reading novels purely for pleasure. On weekends, the family gathered around the dining table, sharing laughter and stories over homemade meals. These simple joys reminded Margaret of what truly mattered: connection, love, and the beauty of ordinary moments. For someone who had spent so much of her life chasing extraordinary achievements, rediscovering the value of simplicity brought a profound sense of peace. Despite stepping away from the spotlight, Margaret stayed involved in advocacy work, albeit in a less formal capacity. She mentored young activists, offering guidance and encouragement as they navigated the complexities of social justice movements. She also collaborated with researchers studying the intersection of technology and law enforcement, ensuring that advancements prioritized ethics and transparency. Her insights proved invaluable, bridging the gap between theory and practice in ways few others could. Christopher, meanwhile, continued to build on the momentum of his advocacy work. He founded a nonprofit organization called Voices Unsilenced, dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted individuals and their families. Through fundraising events, legal clinics, and awareness campaigns, the group provided resources and hope to those navigating the daunting appeals process. Christopher's leadership inspired countless volunteers to join the cause, creating a network of support that spanned states and communities. His tireless dedication earned him accolades, including the prestigious Humanitarian Award, presented by a coalition of civil rights organizations. The bond between Margaret and Christopher grew stronger with each passing year. Their shared experiences had forged an unbreakable connection, rooted in mutual respect and admiration. During quiet evenings at home, they often sat together on the porch, sipping tea and reminiscing about the highs and lows of their journey. "Do you ever regret getting involved?" Christopher once asked, his tone tinged with curiosity. Margaret shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "Not for a second," she replied. "You're my brother. Protecting you wasn't a choice. It was a responsibility, and if doing so helped others along the way, then it was worth every sacrifice." Their partnership extended beyond personal reflection. It became a symbol of resilience and unity. Together, they attended conferences, gave joint interviews, and participated in documentaries highlighting the need for ongoing reform. Audiences marveled at their dynamic, a sibling duo bound by tragedy yet driven by hope. Their message was clear. Justice isn't something you achieve alone. It requires collaboration, courage, and an unwavering belief in the inherent dignity of every individual. As the years rolled on, Margaret and Christopher watched with pride as their efforts bore fruit. Legislation, inspired by Justice Forward, spread to other countries, prompting international dialogues about fairness and accountability. Independent oversight boards uncovered misconduct in high-profile cases, leading to widespread reforms. And perhaps most importantly, public trust in law enforcement began to improve, albeit gradually. These victories weren't perfect. They didn't erase centuries of inequality or guarantee future immunity from mistakes, but they represented tangible progress. For Margaret, the hardest lesson learned was that power alone couldn't guarantee fairness. True justice required action, sacrifice, and an unshakable moral compass. It demanded confronting uncomfortable truths, challenging entrenched systems, and amplifying marginalized voices. And while the work was far from over, she found comfort in knowing that seeds of change had been planted. Future generations would inherit a world shaped by her efforts, a world where fairness wasn't the exception but the rule. On a crisp autumn morning, many years after Christopher's arrest, Margaret stood beside him at the unveiling of a memorial dedicated to victims of wrongful convictions. The monument featured engraved names and quotes from survivors, serving as both a tribute and a call to action. As sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden hues over the gathering crowd, Margaret turned to her brother and smiled. "We did good, Chris," she said softly. "But there's still more to do." Christopher nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "There always will be," he agreed, "and we'll keep doing it. Together." In that moment, surrounded by loved ones and allies, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had faced unimaginable challenges, endured criticism and doubt, and poured every ounce of her being into making the world a better place. And though the scars of the past remained, they were now badges of honor, testaments to a life lived with purpose and passion. For Margaret Reynolds, the fight for justice wasn't just a chapter in her story. It was the essence of who she was. And in embracing that truth, she found lasting peace.